Welcome, Lenny Compton. Welcome. I think I've tried to say welcome to everyone so far. If I've missed anybody, please know that you're welcome. I'm going to put my camera on since we're starting the presentation. So thank you all for joining tonight. First Baptist Church's Watson's Preservation presentation and the information about the National Registry. If you have any questions tonight, please type them in the chat feature that you'll see below. This is going to be recorded, so please know that in advance. We're going to be presented by Mary Ruffin Hanbury of Hanbury Preservation, Loudoun County, the actual preservation office under Heidi Seabright, actually went to bat for Watson, First Baptist Church of Watson, to have a grant. And that grant allowed for us to have a consultant to do the actual research and the development of the document that would be in support of the DHR, which is the Historical Preservation Office in Richmond, to actually do the presentation that we were able to get the actual landmark designation as a historical landmark. So I want to make sure everyone is clear, because Mary Ruffin is her double name that we need to use, is going to be presenting and we're recording. Everyone is going to be muted. I am going to moderate the questions. So if you have a question, type it in. And when Mary Ruffin finishes her presentation, I will read them to her. And if we have enough time, then we'll actually let people speak if we've gone through all the questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to mute everyone. Welcome, Albany. I see. I think everyone else is muted. And Mary Ruffin, we'll let you take over.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good evening, and I will put up my camera when I finish the presentation, but I didn't want to distract you from the slides. Tonight I'm going to be talking to you about First Baptist Church Watson in Loudoun County, and also about the National Register of Historic Places. As Anita said, I'm the consultant who worked on this project, and it was funded by Loudoun County and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources as part of a cost share grant where both the state and the locality shared the cost for the work. So I want to start by just talking about the National Register of Historic Places. It is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. Simply that. This is a screenshot of the National Park Service's webpage about the National Register. We're going to be talking about it tonight, but if you still want more after tonight, this is a good place to start to find more information about the National Register and what it means. It was established in 1966 as part of a piece of legislation called the National Historic Preservation Act. And although it's a federal program, it is partially administered by state historic preservation offices across the country and in the territories, also known as SHPOs, SHPOs. And in Virginia, the SHPO is the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. It's a picture of their office, their Richmond office on Kensington Avenue. It's sort of connected to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture right off Arthur Ashe Boulevard. And like most states, in order to help people through the process, the state requires a preliminary information form, which is not as complicated or time-consuming as a National Register nomination. And they use that to gauge an initial evaluation of whether they think a property is eligible for listing on the National Register. It also gives them a chance to know what's coming down the pike and give advice about things they would like to see in the nomination. And there are a number of different types of property that can be nominated to the National Register. They include buildings. So there on the left is Douglas High School in Leesburg. Structures, on the bottom right is Catoctin Creek Bridge, which is a structure. You can be an object, and this is the only one that's not in Loudoun County on the left. That's one of the original boundary markers for Washington, D.C. that are in Arlington and Alexandria. So that's an object, and that's on the National Register. You can be a historic district like Waterford there in the middle, or you can be an archaeological site like the Old Stone Church archaeological site that's there on the right in the black and white photograph. So there are 5 different types of resources that can be listed. In order to be listed on the National Register, your property has to be significant. And that's further defined as that it has to have significance either under history, significant people, design, construction, or a district where the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, or be an archaeological resource that will yield or is likely to yield information important to history. So that's the technical language, but basically it's history, an important person, design, or archaeology. There are also 7 criteria considerations, and usually this is kind of inside baseball. It's getting kind of in the weeds here. And usually I would skip this in a talk, but actually 2 of these are relevant to Watson, so I included them. So all of these different types of properties have additional requirements in order to be listed on the National Register, a slightly higher bar, if you will, for a lot of reasons. But in this case, Watson is a religious property, and it also has a cemetery. And those are things that needed to be addressed in the nomination that was written. And finally, in addition to significance and meeting any criteria considerations, a property needs to have integrity. And I really hate the fact that that's the word that's used, because it makes it sound like if your property doesn't have integrity, that it's like dishonest or it cheats, or it's just a hard word. But basically, integrity in this context means the ability of the property to convey its significance and to convey its historical appearance. And there's 7 different types. So in the nomination, we talk about each of these types of integrity and how Watson First Baptist has or doesn't have integrity. And it's not a binary, it's not an either or, it's a scale. So in some cases it has more integrity and some has less, and there's no property that has perfect integrity. So it's not anything to worry about. But we want to talk about, does this look the way it has looked? And if it's changed, please discuss that. So those are the issues about integrity. So there are a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be listed on the register, and the most important thing to remember is that the listing is honorary. And that's got 2 meanings in this regard. First is that it is an honor. It's not just any property that can get listed on the National Register. It's a fair amount of work, and you've got to meet specific criteria that we've just talked about. And so it is an honor. But it's also honorary in the sense that it doesn't restrict any pre-existing private property rights. It's not regulatory. And I think a lot of times people get confused because, like, maybe they'll go into Leesburg and they say, well, you've got to go get permission to paint your house because it's in a historic district. That's a local designation that the local government does. The Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places are completely honorary, and sometimes properties are designated by all 3 levels of government, and if they're designated by the local, then they do have restrictions. But we're not talking about that tonight. We're just talking about the National Register and the Virginia Landmarks Register. And so there's nothing that's going to happen to Watson First Baptist that's going to take away any private property rights that you had before this started. It doesn't require that a property be open to the public. Now, for a church, you want to be open to the public, right? You want people to come in and hear the word. But if we were listing somebody's house, they may not want to have people show up and say, oh, it's a historic house, I want to look at it. So being on the National Register does not require you to open your property to the public. One thing that it does do is that the federal government is required to take into consideration historic properties in any of their undertakings. So, for example, anything that a branch of the government does, or anything that a branch of the government provides, loans or grants or permits or licenses, that federal agency or its designee has to make sure that they go through a process to try to mitigate any potential adverse impacts to historic properties. And historic properties are defined as properties that are on or eligible for listing on the National Register. So if VDOT wanted to put a huge 6-lane highway through the property at the church, they'd have to go through a process, and they'd probably end up doing it somewhere else because they don't want to go through that process. So it doesn't restrict the property owner's rights, but it does require the federal government to consider it in their planning process. And finally, listing can qualify properties for certain types of grants and financial incentives, as well as easement programs. It doesn't guarantee that you'll get a grant or a financial incentive or that you'll be able to participate in an easement program, but it is sort of a first step and a first qualifying step for a lot of programs. So there's more information about this at the website listed at the bottom of the slide. So Watson First Baptist, there are a lot of things about it that are sort of in the weeds, and this is the last one that is going to be really technical. There is a type of document that's like a large, very large essay called a multiple property documentation form. And the National Register says if there is a group of properties that are somehow similar, we will let you write a really big historic context that talks about these types of properties and what their shared history is. And if it passes through our organization and we accept it, then any property that shares those characteristics has an easier route to nomination. And we are really lucky that there is a African American Churches in Virginia multiple property document, and we were able to nominate First Baptist Watson under this multiple property document. It's I mean, if you're really interested in history, you can, I'll find a way, maybe I'll send a link somewhere, or I'll get your email address, and if you want to download this and read it, it is a tome. It is a big document, but it talks about, to some extent, that traditionally the African American church was not only a place of worship, but a place for education and for activism and for served a lot of roles beyond only worship, which is legitimate for Watson First Baptist because, you know, your original church building was a school when there weren't schools for African Americans in Loudoun County. So we use this MPDF to help with the nomination process. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. So while this MPDF provides general information, we still needed to provide specific information about Watson First Baptist in our nomination. So I want to talk about some of the sources I used for my research. This is an early map of Loudoun County, and in the center, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, about where Watson is an area called Negro Mountain. And this is an area around Watson, originally named that because a large number of African Americans settled in this part of Loudoun County. Excuse me, and the name was later changed to Watson Mountain. I will tell you, in the course of research, it is thought that perhaps a lot of the African Americans came from Oatlands Plantation, but I couldn't find enough of really strong evidence to cite in the nomination. And so I did not put that in there, but it's a great topic for someone to research in the future. I beg your pardon. All right, a little better. This is another map, and it shows Watson again, but in this case, it's been renamed. But there, along this road, is a little, if you can see it, a little square with a cross, and that is the church, indicated in this early map from the 1920s. Another primary source that I use to better understand the history of the church are deeds. All of these are in the Loudoun County Courthouse in Leesburg. The one on the left is the first deed for the first section of the land for Watson First Baptist Church. It's signed in 1878, and it shows transfer from the Lee family. A second deed over on the right from 1905 shows an expansion of the parcel, a large expansion of the parcel with land from the Thornton family. Other sources that I used, you have a great church history manuscript in your office that was written by hand and later typed, but a first person history of the church, which was extremely useful. I used local histories, aerial photos, and oral histories. These are a couple of aerial photos. The one on the left is from 1937, and the one on the right is from 1957. The one on the left shows the church when it was still a wooden church before it caught on fire. I am not enough of a technical person to be able to sort of overlay them, but just looking at them side by side, it seems to be a little bit smaller. But what really interests me is that the older building was used not only as a church, but as a school. And in a lot of the conversations I had with parishioners, they talked about walking to school. And you can see here, these are the paths that have been worn down and created by the people who walked from Watson to the church. And I think that's a great documentary source, something that just really illustrates that point that was made in these interviews. So I just really love that picture because it just tells you a lot. In 2004, Loudoun County hired a consulting firm to survey African American resources in the county. This document also gave me a good deal of context and background information that was useful for the nomination. And that is also probably available through the county, but it is online if you search for it, if you're interested in reading more. We were very fortunate the contract allowed us to have oral history interviews. And if any of you all are listening who provided an oral history interview, I'll thank you again. It's rare to have a program that is that has that kind of budget, but we recorded them, and it filled in a lot of gaps of knowledge that a lot of the written records did not include. So we had 10 interviews here, 2 of them on the screen. Another part of the nomination is photographic documentation. So in addition to the writing, you have to have photographs. And so I'd like to share a couple of them, not all of them, but just to give you an idea of what was turned in with the written part of the nomination. Here's the exterior. Here's a photograph of the interior looking from the nave up to the altar and the choir. As the church and the congregation had the resources, they expanded the building. So originally it was just the sanctuary, but later they included an office for the pastor that's up in the upper right. And then at the left, a rear addition that included a kitchen and a fellowship hall. One of the things that came out in the oral history interviews is just the great tradition of fellowship over food. A lot of dinners, a lot of meals, a lot of cooking. That was a big part of the congregational life in this church. So having a photograph of that sort of bolsters that argument in the nomination. The church also includes a cemetery. So this is taken from the back of the church, pretty much at the edge of the tree line, looking across the cemetery to the church. And that gives you kind of a sense of the scope and scale of the land that's dedicated to the church and to the cemetery. Um, Not all of the graves are marked. There are some depressions in the ground that are likely burials that may have had markers at one point, and the markers are missing or damaged or just gone. But some of them are, and they run the gamut. The one on the right is a very formal, professionally carved stone obelisk that's there in that enclosed area, which you saw in the previous picture. But the center one and the left one I wanted to include because I just really love them. It is not uncommon, particularly in African American cemeteries, to see these concrete handmade markers. And there are a lot of theories for this. A lot of them is because having been shut out of opportunities for creating generational wealth, a lot of African Americans didn't have the money to get a stone obelisk. And so they couldn't afford that, but they wanted something. And a lot of times, people, African Americans, worked in the trades, and so they understood how to use concrete. They might have been brick masons or contractors, so they had access to the material and knew how to use it. But what I just love about them is that they're made by hand. I mean, this is not something you can buy off the shelf, and to me, that's something that makes it really special. Somebody did this with love for the people who are buried there. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little teary. This resonates very strongly with me. And I think they're beautiful. And I'm so glad that they're in good condition and was glad to include them in the documentation. So First Baptist Church Watson was nominated to the National Register as a district because it includes a cemetery and a church. It was nominated under the African American Churches in Virginia Multiple Property Document. And it was nominated as being locally significant, so significant within the county at that level, in the areas of social history and African American ethnic heritage. It has a period of significance, which every nomination has to call this out, that starts in 1909, which is the oldest stone that we could find that had a date on it. So the oldest date that we could document. And it went to 1976 because there's a 50-year cutoff for listing on the National Register unless you're of transcendent significance. So usually the period of significance has to be at least 50 years old. The nomination, and look, there's Anita. The nomination was presented to the State Review Board and the Virginia Board of Historic Resources at their joint meeting on June 18th. And on that date, the church was listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register because one of the boards that meets has the authority to list it on the Virginia Landmarks Register. Same paperwork, same process. And the other board approved to send this up to the National Park Service for consideration and listing with their recommendation. Every Friday, the National Park Service posts a list of things that have been listed on the register that week, and we haven't gotten there yet, but it takes a while because they're looking at stuff from all over the country. But I check every week, every Friday, check to see if it's listed. So it's coming, but it's on the Virginia Landmarks Register as of now, and the National Register nomination is pending. And finally, before I stop sharing my screen, I just wanted to share this picture. I love this. I don't want to get too touchy-feely with you, but I also go to church, and there's such significance to the concept of the cornerstone and Christ being the cornerstone of the church. And I always love it when a church has a cornerstone for that reason. And it basically says we're putting our mark on the ground here. So it communicates and expresses the congregation's sense of significance of the building and seriousness. So this notes that the church was organized in 1896, and it also shows that it was rebuilt to replace the earlier church that had burned, but on what we believe to be the original foundations. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, if I can figure out how to do this. And I'm going to turn on my camera. we go. And then I'll let Anita organize any questions you might have. I'm more than happy to answer anything, although I'm sure all of you have forgotten more than I will ever know about the church, but I probably can help you out with the process and the impacts.
Thank you. The presentation was wonderful, Mary Ruffin. Thank you so much. While you all are thinking about typing your questions in, I wanted to appreciate not only Mary Ruffin's efforts that she did, but also the women of Watson. During that presentation by the DHR representative, she was very complimentary, and she called out, she said the women of Watson helped with the presentation. She said there was a professional consultant of Mary Ruffin, the Hanbury Preservation, but she made sure that she acknowledged the women of Watson who for the last 2 to 4 years have been working closely on trying to document and provide everything. So from the bottom of all of our hearts, we thank everybody that contributed. We still will need your support. While I wait for questions, I have a question that I'm going to ask Mary Ruffin myself. It was informative to share that there could be renovations to the actual building that they would not go against the landmark. And I'm curious from your vantage point of knowing the grants that are out there. I'm not saying you're an expert, but from your understanding or even your experience, what would be some meaningful grants that we should go after? I always see the markers, the historical markers, those kind of things, but actually the building itself or helping it be a place that people can publicly go in and out and be something very useful. I mean, I even want to use this recording tonight as something that it's a visual that people can listen to your presentation.
Well, every grant and financial program has its own rules. And some of them require you to do renovations in a certain way. And for example, if you had a wooden house and you wanted to put vinyl siding on it, there's some grants that's like, well, the vinyl siding's not historic. We want you to keep the wood and we want you to scrape it and paint it because that's the historic material. So it's really important when you look at these programs to question the grantor or the organization that sponsors them to see what their rules are for how you can use the money. Because sometimes the requirements that they have might be expensive enough that the grant doesn't cover the difference for what you need to do. And I will tell you, we're still recording, right?
Yes, I can stop recording if
No,
it helps.
I just want to say this carefully then.
You can stop recording. This is fine.
No. The National Register generally, let's use an example. If, God forbid, if Watson was still wooden and it burned down again, but it was on the National Register, they would say the church doesn't exist anymore. We're going to take your National Register designation away because there's nothing there. Because we were designating a building and the building doesn't exist anymore. Now, remember when I talked about integrity? It had to do with the historic appearance and the historic materials. Hypothetically, if you radically altered it, somebody could petition that the National Register listing be taken away. I've been working in this field for a long time, and the only example I can think of that, if anybody here watches the Kentucky Derby, it's in Louisville, Kentucky. It's at this racetrack called Churchill Downs, and it's got this big stand with these two big towers. And then maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they wanted to get more revenue, so they built these huge skyboxes on either side of these towers. And so the towers kind of weren't as iconic anymore. They're sort of dwarfed by these. And somebody got really mad, and they went to the Park Service and said, it doesn't have enough integrity anymore with these skyboxes. And I believe that Churchill Downs was delisted. But somebody had to go to the trouble to say, hey, there's nobody for Aubrey von Lindern or anybody else who works at DHR. They're not going to be driving by Watson First Baptist once a year and kind of say, does it still look like it's supposed to look? Does it look like it was when we listed it? There's no real inspection. I mean, they might be driving by and notice something, but nobody's going to come out and monitor what you do. So I won't say that it's that if you change the building a lot, it can't be delisted. I'm just saying that there's no systematic review where people are looking for opportunities to delist properties.
Question was more
That makes
specifically,
sense?
are there grants that you would say we should go after sooner, since we got this designation that would be helpful for any kind of renovation? That's what
You
I'm
know,
asking.
um, grants for bricks and mortar for capital expenditures are harder to find, but I will tell you that the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is headquartered in Washington, has a number of programs not only for churches but for African American resources. That's been a big push of theirs in the last several years, and that's where I would look first. And the nice thing is they're headquartered in Washington, so it's easy for staff to get out to where you are versus say maybe where I am in North Carolina. It's just a quick commute, but that's the first place I would look. And the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, I think, does have a list of grants, potential grants. Another thing to do if you really like research, there is an organization called the Foundation Center, and they keep records on every foundation in America that gives money. And they used to have these big books, like it was like encyclopedias where you could look up who gave money in your state. They now have it on a database, which a lot of public libraries carry. So you can go use the computer at the library and you could type in historic preservation, church, African American, Virginia, and they'll give you a list of anybody who gives money in those categories. So it's a good place to start. There are a number of private foundations in Virginia that give to preservation, and again, being put on the National Register. But for fundraising, it's all how you want to slice